We're about 5 after now. So Bob, what do you think? Can we get started? Sound good to you?
I'm ready when you are.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys again for joining us. Hopefully, if anybody else joins us, then I'll be monitoring and letting people in. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask away. We've got a couple of different presentations actually here tonight. Bob is a photographer and author, educator, and so we're happy to have him joining us. And thank you to the Friends of the Dover Library for always sponsoring our programs like this. So without further ado, I'll let Bob take it away.
Great, thanks, Jim. Hi, everybody. As Jim mentioned, there's a lot of data, a lot of information on 2 different underwater archaeology projects here in Massachusetts. So as we proceed through each program, please ask questions as we go. This particular one is on the Minot Light lighthouse off of Scituate. Then halfway through, we're going to switch to go inland to Lake Quinsigamond and Worcester and Sudbury and talk about some 350-year-old Native American dugout canoes called Project Mishoon. So I don't want to wait until we get to Mishoon imagery to talk about the Minot Light project. So please feel free to field your questions as we go. There is no bad questions, only those that have not been put out there. So if I don't have the answer, I'll find out what it is and I'll get back to Jim and we'll get you the correct answer. So let's proceed. So the Minot Light Lighthouse is a collaboration of, as you can see, many organizations: the U.S. Coast Guard, Mass Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources, Mass Environmental Police, Quincy Police, Cohasett Harbor Master, UMass Boston, U.S. Coast Guard Foundation in Wisconsin, Wisconsin Historical Society, my company, Photography, Bill Michelson, historical writer John Galuzzo, local divers Tom Malloy and Hank Lynch, and many other people, too numerous to get into here. So this project, the objectives of this project is to find and document the original 1850 Minot Light Lighthouse remains for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. Provide training and opportunity to train U.S. Coast Guard safety divers in underwater science diving, underwater archaeology. These folks can swim circles around me, but they're not trained in how to look for things that don't belong on the bottom. They're looking for munitions, bodies, shipwrecks, things that are obvious to a trained professional like these guys are, but they're not trained in how to look for an odd shape in the bottom. It's got 150 years worth of sea growth on it. So a lot of this was training the Coast Guard divers how to do underwater archaeology, which was a real trip for me because these guys could swim circles around me. They were just strong as anything, swim circles around me. But as I'm videotaping some debris in this particular project, they're swimming overhead and just swimming past us because they didn't see it because they weren't trained what to look out for. The other objective is to examine seabed hazards such as discarded batteries that used to power this lighthouse back in the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, sorry. Provide training to the Abbey Burgess Coast Guard cutter based out of Maine in diving operations that have never done that before. The Coast Guard brought in dive units from New York, Boston, San Diego, and the Gulf of Mexico to work with us on this particular project. And the final dream from the chairperson for the Mass Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources was to create the first underwater park in Massachusetts. That sadly still has not happened. The economy tanked shortly after we did this. It never rebounded. Agencies lost personnel, never backfilled the positions, and the rest you know from the last year or so. So here we are diving off of Minot Light, off of Scituate. We're shallow ledges, 30, 40 feet deep, which is not that deep when you're a mile offshore. Divers are looking for the remains of the lighthouse. Now, what are we looking for? This is Boston Light. It's on Little Brewster Island in Boston Harbor. It was first built in 1719 and burnt by retreating American forces in 1775 during the American Revolution. The current lighthouse was built right after that war in 1783 and remains and looks the same way it was built over 2 centuries ago. This is the original Minot Light lighthouse. It was a spindle design lighthouse. A lighthouse of this design had never been put on the east coast of the United States before. It had been used widely in European areas, the UK, France, Norway, etc., but never used on the east coast of the United States. So our nor'easters had never been applied against how these things would stand up to the weather that we have around here. So the original light was built in 1850. Now, what happened was in April of 1851, it was the perfect storm of that era. Massive waves of over 50 feet churned up the seas. Now, as you can see here, the way that they got up to the lighthouse is there was a buoy, a cable, and a chair that they came out with a dory. They had to pull themselves up this cable to the lightkeeper's quarters up here. But because there wasn't any space, I'm going to back up one. They built the second compartment here and a third platform, even another 10 feet closer to the ocean. The original lighthouse design was only supposed to be this structure up. So now we've got another 20 feet of structure that the waves can come up underneath and lift this off of the ledge that it's anchored on. Now, back in the 1800s, there were no hydro drills. Everything was hand drilling. They had a hand drill into the granite ledge off of Scituate. Several people perished while doing this. They could only drill at low tide because the ledge is underwater at high tide. So there was a lot of things that were against everybody. They could only drill down 2 to 3 feet into the rock. They didn't have the hard steel reinforced concrete that we have these days. So the lighthouse was already at risk when it was first built. And then we add the perfect storm to this. The waves came up underneath this platform, lifted it off of the ledge, knocked it into the sea with the loss of both lighthouse keepers. So there is tragedy. Now, this current lighthouse has been there since 1860. They decided to go with an all granite design similar to Boston Light. And as you can see, 200 years plus later, it's still there doing very well. This is what Minot Ledge looks like at high tide. You only see the stone at low water. So what we had to do first is go out with the Mass Environmental Police. We had researchers from UMass Boston with us. We were doing circle search patterns around the existing lighthouse, northwest, east, and south of the current lighthouse. They were dropping in a side scan sonar device on the sister ship, the Jessie, which is no longer in service. This is back in 2007, 2008. Jessie's been taken out of service about 5 years ago. She was the Mass Environmental Police's largest vessel. So here we have, they're lowering the device and they're going to start doing surveys around the island. Here's the toe or the fish just under the surface. Now, because it's so shallow, they couldn't lower the fish down 10, 15, 20 feet like they normally would. They had it just under the surface of the water. This is the readout. This is the keel of the boat right down the middle. This is the right or starboard side. This is the left or port side of the boat. And this is ledge, more ledge with all kinds of debris all over the place. There was so much debris from so many shipwrecks over several centuries that nothing can be disseminated to figure out what was where. So this proved to be futile. Here's Dr. Alan Gauntz, the chief researcher from UMass Boston, with a couple of his technicians looking at the data, trying to figure out what can we do next. Then they launch an underwater magnetometer attached to a buoy to keep this just near the surface, because some of the passes, there were only 10, 15 feet of water under the keel of the research boat. So if this thing went down any deeper, they'd be out a several $1,000 magnetometer, which we did not want to happen. Now, underneath the ledge, there's iron, there's steel everywhere. Not all of this material is from the original 1850 lighthouse. There's been several revamps, including when they were building the current lighthouse of 1860. There were no I-beams in the 1800s. That wasn't invented until the 1900s. So iron all over the place, steel all over the place. We didn't thankfully find any batteries, but cabling back in just after World War I, they ran an electric cable from shore 2 miles to Minot Light to power it so the light would be effective. Right now it's privately owned, and it's operated by solar power. Batteries are charged up during the daytime. At night, it flashes its normal signal. So here we have the Abbey Burgess down from Portland, Maine. We have their chase boat that the way that it works with Coast Guard divers is Coast Guard divers are synonymous with US Navy divers. And unless you're certified as a US Navy diver, you cannot dive with them off of the same dive platform. We could meet at the bottom, but I had to dive from a different boat than the Coast Guard divers. So I dove off of the Mass Environmental Police boat. The first day diving, they lowered a plaque right next to the current lighthouse in about 40 feet of water with a 2-ton granite brick with a plaque commemorating the loss of the 2 lighthouse keepers in 1851. It was the anniversary this particular year. So here are the Coast Guard divers now diving off of the Cohasset Harbor Master's boat on the lighthouse, and they are on the northeast side of the lighthouse. Now, I'm a Boston guy. I know when we have a nor'easter, the winds are blowing from the northeast to the southwest. So any debris found on this lighthouse should be south and west of the lighthouse, not north and east of the lighthouse. That proved to be true 2 days later. So here are the Coast Guard divers going in. They're wearing full face masks with no secondary tank for bailout. They ended up sadly running out of air. They all made it to the surface safely, but they ran out of air after half an hour and reconfigured their dive gear. Now, myself and my dive buddy, who we're science divers, we're not Navy divers. We're down at the bottom. Here's the plaque. The Coast Guard cutter released the chain. They tied a buoy to it so we could find it and go down and take our pictures with the marker. Then they brought it up with a 300-pound lift bag. This is the Coast Guard divers doing this work. The whole day was a bust. We found nothing. We were searching in the wrong area. The Coast Guard divers were swimming over us, doing circles like I mentioned at the very beginning, but they didn't really know what to look for. So then we went back to the Coast Guard base in Boston on Commercial Street, and I spent a full day training the divers in underwater archaeological techniques. So here's a diver measuring relief off of the bottom. That is how much height there is off of the bottom. And you measure it from an angle. You measure it straight up from where the rock or the artifact is on the bottom. The second diver is writing on an underwater slate, recording the data. And they use hand signals and other gestures to communicate what data gets transferred onto the slate. Now, this diver, when he's underwater, is actually writing a sketch of what he and his partner are observing. This diver will take the measurements. This diver will record the data, and he'll write a sketch. He'll draw a sketch of what he's seeing. Now, the plan was when they found any artifacts that looked like they dated to the 1800s, myself and my dive buddy who waited on the environmental police boat would go down. My job was to photograph and videotape the remains and provide GPS coordinates of where we found and what debris we found. So the Coast Guard was challenged with finding the artifacts, finding the debris fields. My job was to go down and document what we found. So a full day of every Coast Guard diver taking an opportunity with waterproof measuring tapes. The clip would clip onto the diver. This is a 100-foot line that you would clip it onto an anchor, and you'd swim around 5-10-foot intervals in circles as far as the visibility underwater would allow. and whatever distance you can see, you'd extend that line another 5 or 10, 15 feet, and you do another circle. And you always leave an orange marker where you began your search. You come back to it, you extend the line out another 10 feet until your 100-foot line has been expelled. Then you move to a different grid in a search area. So it's very time consuming. It takes a lot of coordination when you've got 4 dive teams in the water at the same time. And that part worked out very well. So here's the environmental police boat that I was diving on. We were just floating around. We actually got called on an emergency call going up to Gloucester while the Coast Guard divers were underwater trying to find a debris field. I never got bounced around so much in my life on a boat. That was a trip. So now we're in the bottom. We found some legs. This is a Coast Guard diver attaching an underwater sausage and tying it onto the debris, sending it to the surface. The underwater archaeologist with the state would come up to that buoy, take a GPS reading, notate where the debris was found. Then my job was to go down, photograph it, videotape it from as many angles as was physically possible. So here the diver is measuring the circumference of the iron leg. Now, this particular leg was the appropriate dimensions. We were looking for about 15 inches in diameter, sections that were 8 to 10 feet long. And iron, when it breaks down, becomes almost veinous. It's not perfectly smooth. It gets very, very choppy. And if you tap it with a rock or a knife, a black cloud of smoke will come up. That lets you know that it's iron and not steel. So we're now in a debris field. The Coast Guard diver is recording his data. This is what they found was one piece of debris that was 6 feet in length. It went underneath a large boulder. So this was determined to be most likely the correct age to be from the 1850s. So we took photos of this from every possible angle and we moved on. Here the diver is holding the end of the tape measure and recording the data that the other diver is taking with the tape measure. This diver is also charged with sketching what he saw on the bottom, which is where this came from. This is from this diver, actually. So this particular leg proved to be hollow and was steel. So it was the wrong error. We still photographed it. We still sent up a marker to the surface so the archaeologist could plot where it was located, but it wasn't what we were looking for. Here's the lengthy pipe. This thing was 15 feet long. It was hollow. It was a steel pipe. It didn't belong here. It was probably used during some rehab work that was done on the lighthouse back in the 1960s. And here's an I-beam. I-beams didn't exist in 1850. This we immediately ruled out as being probably from the rehab in the 1960s, because I-beams were not even around in 1860 when the current lighthouse was constructed. So what I was looking for were these angle joints at the end of a leg. This would tell me I'm looking at the support to the superstructure, the sleeping quarters of the lighthouse. We were buzzed by several sharks along the way. Then we got our heads back on and we found legs. We found more and more iron legs that were the right diameter, the right length, and we kept moving south and west in the direction that I felt we should be moving to find any debris from the original lighthouse. More debris. Here's an iron leg again from the 1850s. Interesting find that was incidental is this mass of gelatinous yellow yuck is actually the first documented case of a highly invasive tunicate called Didymnum sp. We knew it was suffocating 75 square nautical miles of Georges Bank, the critically important commercial fishing grounds. It had never been documented this close to shore. So as a total separate sidebar, we identified and located and photographed a highly invasive species a mile off the coast of Scituate. Now it's everywhere. Now we start to get interested. We're going further south and west, and look at this. Here's a leg. Here's an angled piece with a flat top. Bingo. we found one of the support legs from the original Minot Ledge Lighthouse built in 1850. So here's the diver's sketch. By relief, I'm talking the leg is up at an angle. There's a space underneath it. It's leaning up against boulders. They measured it to be a foot above. So this is the relief off of the bottom. 61 inches in length, 3 feet in diameter, which means it's about 15 inches across. Perfect. This section was 9 feet, 2 inches long. We were looking for about 10 feet in length, 2 to 3 feet around, 15 inches in diameter, 1 foot across. We found the legs from the original lighthouse. Now it's my job to take pictures. So again, this is the original light. These are the support beams that we found. Now it's time to get busy. We found several of these angled support legs attached to a leg that went underneath another iron leg. I did top view, side view, north, south, east, and west angle from ground level, from above, 45, 90 degrees, just to get the archaeologist a clear vision of what was there and how it was configured on the seafloor. Here's a top view looking at the angled leg. And here's the leg going in north direction. So this is proof positive. We found the lighthouse. It's the first time it had been found since the 1850s when it went down. And it was about 150 yards south and west of the current lighthouse, which is where those of us that live up here and dive up here knew that's the direction the debris field should be. So our hypothesis was proven correct, and we have the proof to show for it. So the divers continued and there were 8 divers from 4 different dive teams. Each dive team of 2 went down. We alternated. When they found other portions of the debris field, myself and my dive buddy would follow behind them, conduct photography. I passed my still camera to my partner, my dive buddy. He'd give me the video camera. I'd videotape it, do a 360 swim around it with live video. And we went back up to the Abbey Burgess and had lunch. Along the way, we found cable, electrical cable everywhere. This stuff is 2 to 3 inches in diameter. If you find an end, it's all copper. This is the power line that was put out there right after the First World War to power the Minot Ledge Lighthouse. It's everywhere. So this is what it looks like in 1850 before the perfect storm in 1851. This is what it looks like right now. Pieces of iron strewn all over the place and a cone shape from the original lighthouse out south and west of the current lighthouse. Most of this debris is in about 30 to 35 feet of water, and we found more of the Didymnum SP everywhere we searched. A diver's trying to get his eyes and ears all around this thing, measuring the complete circumference of it. Here's 2 pieces of iron leg going 2 different directions. We found massive piles of this about 150, 200 yards off the current lighthouse. So this is the current light. It's made out of granite. It's now privately held. Sadly, the U.S. Coast Guard, which used to have custody of all lighthouses in the United States, has relinquished custody to private owners. Thanks to the former Senator Ted Kennedy, Boston Light is still owned by the federal government and always will be. He passed legislation years ago before he got sick and left us. So I'm very, very thankful for him that the Coast Guard still operates Boston Lighthouse even today. Every other lighthouse that you see is privately owned right now. Any questions about this portion of the archaeology program?
Bob, what would you talked about the supports and everything, but what would the top of the structure have been made out of?
It was made out of wood.
Okay.
The entire housing itself was made of wood. They were small, thin pieces of iron that the wood was attached to, but the entire structure itself was wood. That's all they had back in the 1850s. There was no steel. Steel hadn't been invented yet. They should have used granite. The whole thing was an experiment that failed miserably. The lighthouse was a design from Europe that should never have been put on the east coast of the United States, and no other lighthouse of that design was ever installed on the Atlantic side of the United States after this tragedy of 1851. Any other questions about Minot Light? Okay, let's continue. A couple pretty shots of Boston. Yeah, of course you have to end a slideshow with something. I was hoping to produce a documentary on this particular project, and because of the economy that hit, we did our dives in 2007. As you know, the economy tanked in 2007, 2008, never fully recovered. I still have footage from back then. I'd like to produce a documentary. That's part of what I do for a living, but it's just not on the cards right now. The support team that we used, half of them lost their jobs, had to reinvent themselves. So the divers and the support team aren't there anymore. And the Coast Guard did away with all of their dive teams. So we don't even have US Coast Guard dive teams anymore. So this project, the next project that we're going to look at is Project Mishoon. And myself and another diver, Michael Prang, formed a loosely knit group of divers called ADAM, the Archaeological Divers Association of Massachusetts. We trained about 45 divers that are all volunteers in how to conduct underwater archaeology to dive on the Mishoon that are in Lake Quinsigamond. Here is myself. I know you can recognize the hairline. It's about the same, but it's more in a tan coloration right now than black. Right at the surface, the marker is where my dive partner, Michael Prang, found one of the Mishoon. And the same deal, I was saving my bottom time for photography and video, not for searching. So when Michael found it, I swam out to him. I can't tell you where, I'd have to do something. We're sworn to secrecy. We cannot tell anybody where this Mishoon are located. I'm not going to tell you if they're in Worcester or Shrewsbury. All I can tell you is they're in Lake Quinsigamond. And I can tell you the depths, but that's not going to help you find anything. So this is a PowerPoint presentation provided to me by the Nipmuck Nation in Worcester, showing how Native American or indigenous people made their dugout canoes. And it's rather choppy because it's very old. So a large tree, tall and straight, was felled by burning it around the base until it toppled. White pine or chestnut were the most commonly used. They would then put a fire inside the Mishoon, burn it, scrape it out with very, very crude tools. They didn't have any steel tools back then. Not until the Pilgrims came over did they get some European interactiveness and get some tools that had iron. So they mostly were using wood to scrape the ash out of the canoe. It was very, very tedious. It took them weeks to make a dugout canoe. After placing the log on supports, they'd remove the bark and branches, then alternating between burning and scraping, the inside of the log was dug out or scraped out to form the Mishoon. And it took days, even weeks, I'm told. So here is a Mishoon, a rendition of Native Americans with a fire in the boat, still scraping it out, and they're raking for shellfish. There's fish all over the water. They built weirs to capture fish. They speared fish. They used bow and arrows to catch fish. There was no side scan sonar to say, hey, here was the school, let's go fishing. So because of the weight of these things, the Mishoon weighed upwards of a ton. They weren't easy to move. One big long Mishoon is averaging about 15 feet in length and 1.5 tons. So the counterpart, the birch bark canoe, was much lighter, a lot more portable. It could be traveled from one campsite to another. The Mishoon were typically built by Native American tribes, such as the Nipmuck tribe in central Mass, that once had from central Connecticut, central Massachusetts, southern New Hampshire, and southern Vermont. That was their home territory. They would make the canoe and it would stay on the body of water that they lived in. So for storage, the owners would intentionally sink the canoes by loading them with large rocks. Yep. And they would overwinter under the water. That way their enemies couldn't get them and they would stay preserved under the fresh water. Now, this all took place at about 1675. This is during the time of King Philip's War. So the Nipmuck Nation hid their canoes underwater so rival tribes, the Iroquois, Abenaki, the Wampanoags, couldn't come and steal their canoes. So that submerged them underwater. This is at the same time in history that the first dam, excuse me, the first dam was built on Lake Quinsigamond. So the following year, the same Native American tribe would go back and try to retrieve their Mishoonash. Now they're down 10 to 15 feet. They didn't have scuba gear back then. So the Mishoonash stayed where they were. Add a couple of centuries, more dams are built, the water levels brought up even higher. Right now, the Mishoon are in between 30 to 40 feet of water. Thank you. So here's diver Michael Prang, who is using a rebreather, getting geared up at the edge of a dock near where we went into the water to document 2 of the Mishoon. This is myself with my video camera. Michael had a still camera. We found 2 of the Mishoon that particular day. I went back another day and we found a 3rd Mishoon on the other side of the lake. Again, I can't tell you where. The Mishoon on this side are completely intact. When they sank down the side of the lake, add 300 years of time, sediments built, trash was thrown in the water, it decomposed. The 15-foot Mishoon are now only exposed by about 3 to 4 feet. The rest of them are buried in the side of the lake bed. And the lake goes down at a good 45 degrees where we were located. So here are the first set of photos of Mishoon number 1. This is the most exposed Mishoon. This one has about 8 to 10 feet of canoe exposed. These are completely intact, still laden with rocks, as left by the Native Americans back in 1675. I know this because before I got involved in 2007, the underwater archaeologist with the state, Victor Mishoon, took a wood sample, a core sample from one of the canoes, had it carbon dated, and it carbon dated back to 1675. So we know these Mishoon date back to King Philip's War, which took place at the same time. So this is the very edge of where the exposed Mishoon is. If you go further this way, it's buried in the mud. So we're working our way out to the stern of the boat. Now, we were under a strict no-touch policy. Pine or oak, after being in the water for 300 years, loses all of its solidification. It's like gelatinous in texture. So if you waved your hand over it, it moved. It was jelly-like. So we were under a very strict no-touch policy. So we're 1 to 2 feet above the Mishoon, conducting our photography and video, and being extremely careful. We had to invert ourselves. So our fins are up here, our arms are extended down here, so we did not disturb these artifacts. We're getting out into deeper water, more rocks are exposed. Here's the stern of the boat. Here's the marker that we sent up to the surface. Part of what we were tasked with, let me show you a composite. This is what the Mishoon looks like. It was stitched together from 17 individual photographs. I have the same thing in video. So I videotaped from here to the stern and back again. And then the silt in this lake is so fine. It's like a mushroom cloud coming up just by moving a hand like this. And the visibility was gone for the rest of the day. So then we moved on to the other Mishoon that we could find. Here's a side scan sonar image. Here's the side of the lake. Here's the Mishoon we were just diving on. You can see here's where the mud ends, and it's now flat on the bottom of the lake bed. One thing to note, and part of what our task was, they did not know what kind of hazards were around these artifacts. These are extremely delicate 350-year-old Native American artifacts that have no cover. They're not protected. Somebody comes by with an anchor, kiss this dugout canoe goodbye. We found 55-gallon barrels, truck tires, trash barrels within 6 yards of these Mishoon. A strong storm would blow the barrel into the Mishoon and destroy it. Here's the second look at the second same Mishoon. We're looking at, this is the contour of the side of the lake. This is shallow water. This is where the bottom of the lake is. This is the keel of the boat doing the side scan sonar. And here's a barrel here. You can see it, truck tire, barrel, barrel, 2 more barrels. These are 4 feet away from the Mishoon, 5 feet away from the Mishoon. I went back a couple of weeks later. On the other side of the lake, in only 13 feet of water, was a third Mishoon. This one was completely broken open. The rocks were still laid in the keel of the Mishoon, but it had been beat up over the centuries. It didn't even resemble a boat. It just looked like rocks with a piece of wood underneath it. So here's some photos of that Mishoon. This is all that's left of the wood. From here up is gone. The bow gone. The stern, a small smidgen of wood is still there. Rocks are just falling out of the center of the Mishoon. Now I'm looking around the Mishoon. Here's the remains of the bow. That's all that's left. Is about 6 inches of relief off the bottom instead of what should be 1.5 feet. And we're finding motorcycle tires within arm's reach of this Mishoon. Barrels within arm's reach of this Mishoon. So we have problems to deal with. And this is between the Nipmuck Nation, the Massachusetts Board of Underwaterological Resources, and the Lake Quinsigamond Lake Association to figure out what to do to protect these things. That's beyond my realm of expertise. I don't get involved in that. I'm brought in to provide dive support, photography, video, and back in 2007, when we conducted these dives, Victor Mishoon, the director of the Board of Archaeology, really wanted us to excavate, recover, and conserve one of these Mishoon in a lakeside museum that the tribe was trying to establish. Again, that was 2007. You all know what happened in 2008. Things never recovered. The nation has still not been able to come up with a vacant building that we can build a recovery tank to go through the next steps of filing for permits to now remove a 350-year-old artifact. When we have a strategy on how to do that, it would be extremely time consuming, would require a lot of volunteer hours. And that's why we formed Adam to build a core of divers that we knew were highly experienced. We handpicked them. We trained them in underwater archaeological techniques, and we knew they'd be gingerly careful of these artifacts, and every one of them was sworn to absolute secrecy. We cannot divulge where they're located. They're too close to the populations. The people there are very protective of their heritage. It was so nice to see when we were out in the water that the people that know where these canoes are were coming out and making sure we were who we were supposed to be. It was very, very nice to see that. Cinder blocks, less than at arm's length away from Mishoon number 3. So there's issues here. Here's the side scan sonar of Mishoon number 3. It's in the middle of the lake. Here's the shoreline. It's very, very close proximity to the shore. This lake drops off on one side very steeply, on the other side much more gradually. I'm on the gradual side, and again, I'm not going to tell you which side that is. Just that I'm only in 13 feet of water, about 100 yards offshore. On the other side of the lake, I'm in 42 feet of water, 50 yards offshore. So here's the Mishoon, all broken up. You can see the rocks, a very slight shadow cast by the wood that remains on this Mishoon. Does anybody have any questions? So let me just leave you with the project right now is in a state of limbo. The Nipmuck Nation is trying to come up with the funds in a building where they could then file for the permits that's required from the state to have us come in, excavate, secure, shore up the Mishoon as we're excavating. We have a strategy on how to do that. Build a steel frame around the Mishoon while filling it with liquid foam or concrete to make sure that the Mishoon doesn't collapse once we take the mud away that's supporting it. So we're now waiting for the Mishoon Nation, the Nipmuck Nation to come up with a structure on the lakeshore, come up with the needed permitting from the state to remove an artifact of this nature. Then we can start putting together a dive plan. All of this is done under the auspices of an underwater archaeologist. And the person that's been doing this is Dave Robinson. Dave was with University of Rhode Island up until last year when he was hired to become the director of the Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources when Victor Mishoon retired a year ago. So the underwater archaeologist that was in charge of this project back in 2000 when it began is now in charge of the state for all underwater resources. So it's really cool that Dave's in this position. He's very passionate about this. He's he's befriended a lot of the tribal members, and they actually go together for powwows and gather socially. I don't do that. Fascinating, but they live too far away. They don't live here in Massachusetts. Some are in Connecticut, some are in New Jersey. They're all over the Northeastern United States. So right now, we're trying to come up with a building along the lake shore. And the reason for that is these Mishoon are so delicate that with all of our precautions and strategies to secure it up and shore it up as we excavate the mud from around it, and then we're going to filter the debris that's siphoned. We're going to be using an underwater vacuum to remove the mud, and we don't want to lose any artifacts that might be captured in that mud that go along with their heritage. So there's going to be a screen downstream. There is a current in this lake. There's going to be a screen downstream with the debris filters through the screen to preserve and catch any debris, any artifacts that we might have uncovered while we were vacuuming. And we don't want to remove the Mishoon from the water. The whole idea is it's very difficult terrain to maneuver from land to where these things are in the water. We were hoping to extend a crane out from shore, float the Mishoon close to shore. The crane would lift it out, immediately put it into a container on a waiting truck, move it wet to the storage facility, and then the archaeologists would start their conservation process. That would take years because they need to remove the pulpiness of the wood, reintroduce the solid structure of the wood, and that is a chemical process that takes years. So I'm looking forward to going back and doing this, but we're still waiting for a space to have a museum, a place where we can bring up a Mishoon, put it in, and they can do the proper conservation on these artifacts. And then all other artifacts in this lake can then be housed and shown at this particular museum. That is the objective. It's still on hold, sadly. And the Minot Light project, creating the first underwater park, that's also on hold. These both started in 2007, just before the downward spiral and the recession started. And as I mentioned back then, most of the support craft, the personnel, they're gone. The resources are gone. We don't have the support boats. We don't have the Abby Burgess to come down from Portland. We don't have Coast Guard divers to help us with volunteer labor. It would be a training exercise for them, but this is extremely labor intensive. and there's only a handful of us that want to keep pursuing this. It's not enough to make the job happen. So, and then funding is it's almost non-existent right now. All the state and federal agencies that would be in charge of something like this have had their budget cut back so far that when somebody retires, now they're not backfilling the positions anymore. So there's fewer and fewer people on staff to help on a project of this nature. So this is some of the work that we do. I am a NOAA certified science diver. I was trained in 2 days of very heavy duty training from RIMAP in Rhode Island. The director of RIMAP in Rhode Island, they were one of the first underwater archaeological groups in the East Coast to establish and train dozens of divers in proper techniques using scientific techniques for underwater archaeology. They came up and trained our dive team. At that time, I was the dive master in charge of the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary's dive team that we had created in 2001. We received 2 full days of training. We went down to Mass Maritime Academy in Buzzards Bay and spent 2 full days with the director of RIMAP, a day of intense training in the classroom, a day of intense training in a pool, measuring, notating, learning. It's a very steep learning curve. But thankfully, having a science diver backdrop, it made it a little bit easier to understand the processes. And now we can apply it to almost anything that we do moving forward. With that, I believe I'm done talking. Does anybody have any questions?
Bob, Celestia, in regards to the Mishoons, was wondering, would PEGs be used to stabilize the wood?
Would what?
Pegs be used to stabilize the wood?
That is beyond my realm of expertise. I don't think they would use anything that would have to be hammered into or drilled into one of the Mishoon. I believe the treatment for wood that's been submerged in fresh or salt water for extended periods of time, and usually it's fresh water. Wood that's in salt water is attacked by saltwater woodworms. They don't usually last that long. So the Mishoon are down in a level in Lake Quinsigamond where it's black. There's no light. There's no oxygen. We don't see any aquatic life at the depth that we're diving. It's anaerobic, and that's what's helped preserve the Mishoon for so long. It's mainly, from my understanding, Jim, it's a chemical process. No physical harm is done to the artifacts. They're submerged in a solution. Chemicals are added, flushed out, added, flushed out, and it takes a period of years to bring back the solid mass that once was a fallen pine or elm tree.
She clarified it's PEGs is polyethylene glycol.
That may be one of the chemicals that they use. That's a conservationist job. That's way beyond my field of expertise. I know how to find, document, and recover an artifact like this. The preservation and conservation is a complete different specialty. I have no knowledge of that whatsoever. It sounds like it would be viable. It would be something solid to give rigidity to the structure, but I don't know if that's what they'd want to use. I don't know if the Nipmuck Nation would want to introduce something fake to their heritage. These folks, the Native Americans, the indigenous people that I've had the honor of meeting are extremely proud of their heritage, and changing what they had back in that time period is not something that sits well with members of the tribal society. So I don't know if that'd be conducive to allowing that to happen, or if they'd rather a more natural process. And again, that's for the conservationists. That's not for the science diver that recovers the artifacts.
And do you know, is it likely that there are more Mishoons down there?
I believe at this point in time, my contact is Cheryl Stetler. She's in charge of Project Mishoon. And they have now imaged the entire lake with side scan sonar technology, the entirety of the lake. And they've only found the 3 Mishoon that we know of. But
would the debris that you mentioned, could that have maybe wrecked some that may have been there?
I don't think so, because there'd still be remnants. The rock piles would still be there from the ballast that was added to sink these to begin with. that would still be in place to some measure of something that didn't look like it belonged on the bottom. A pile of rocks this long doesn't belong in a mud bottom lake. So if that's all that remained, or if it was jagged and S-shaped, it would still look like something that didn't belong down there, and that would have been counted as a fourth Mishoon. But the
Cool.
concern is there was a tornado that went down the middle of Lake Quinsigamond. I believe it was in 1965, and that pulled in all the barrels and the truck tires into the lake. So these tires have been there now for 50, 60 years. In every major storm, they get inched closer and closer to these artifacts. So our strategy right now is to build, with permission, some kind of frame around the Mishoon to protect them. So if someone drops an anchor or there's a massive storm and the barrels move even more, that they don't destroy these artifacts. Because nobody's been back down to look at these in 12 years.
Well,
Any other questions?
doesn't sound like it. Well, I want to thank you very much for doing this for us, Bob. This was very cool and very informative, and hopefully everyone that joined us learned something new.
Well, if I could, I may be stretching out of bounds. Project Mishoon is a nonprofit. It's owned and operated by the Native American tribe, the Nipmuck Nation, which is state certified in Massachusetts. If you Google Project Mishoon, Mishoon, they have their own website. There are different ways, like when you go shopping to buy stuff for your kids for school, you can get points for college credit for shopping. Project Mishoon has something similar, where if you go shopping through that link, they end up with donations to help this project move it along. So they're a nonprofit. It's all owned and operated by Native Americans, indigenous people from all over the Northeastern United States. They're lovely people. I can't do enough to help them. And if you wanted to try to take a look at their website to see more, they have a lot more images than what I showed you on their website about their culture, their history, about the tribe itself. It's really interesting reading. So projectmishoon.org, a really cool website to check out.
Yeah, sounds like it. Well, all right. I guess we will wrap it up then for this evening. Thank you again. Thank you for everybody for sticking around and joining us this evening.